Everybody will get started shortly. Okay, welcome everyone to the first Green Infrastructure, Climate and Cities seminar of 2025. My name is Franco Montalto. I'm one of the co-investigators on CC Run and one of the organizers of this session, which has been going on since 2014. You're joining us for the first time. We offer continuing education credits for professional engineers, and all of our previous webinars have been archived on the CC Run website, and we invite you to go check those out. This particular webinar will be recorded and archived there as well, so feel free to come back to it later to get more information that you may have missed. Let me advance these slides. So I'm really excited today to introduce two colleagues, Richard Roark and Nate Wooten of Olin Landscape Architecture and Urban Design, and their presentation today focusing on engaging a changing world, design for communities and ecosystems. They're going to talk to us about a number of projects. Richard is a partner at Olin, where his work spans a range of scales and typologies, focusing on expanding the civic capacity of the landscape. Projects such as the competition-winning design for Hunts Point under the Rebuild by Design initiative, the new U.S. Embassy in London, and Dilworth Park in Philadelphia exemplify his practice focused on sustainable, economical, and well-crafted public design. Richard is currently completing work on a waterfront pavilion at Sojourner Truth State Park along the Hudson River, and developing a sea level rise social and environmental justice plan for the communities of Caño, Peña, and realizing an innovative flood mitigation plan for New York City Housing Authority communities in Red Hook, Brooklyn. Richard also serves on the board for Studio Ludo, an innovative play research nonprofit, and regularly provides pro bono design services through Philadelphia's Community Design Collaborative. So Richard is joined by Nate, an associate at Olin, who leads a range of project scales and types, including stormwater and waterfront resiliency parks, and larger scale municipal and regional planning efforts. Significant large scale projects at Olin have included the LA County River Master Plan, Rio Hondo Confluence Area Project, and Sojourner Truth State Park, as was mentioned previously. Nate, in particular, also manages Olin's Tech Lab, where he directs research into data visualization and communication, and how new technologies can foster heightened interactions between people and the environment. And Nate's a licensed architect and teaches regularly at University of Pennsylvania Design Studios in landscape architecture. So we're really grateful for Richard and Nate joining us today to tell us about their practice and about how they engage climate and other complicated topics in their projects. So following their presentation, as usual, we'll have a Q&A. So please put your questions in the chat. Not in the chat, in the Q&A. And with that, I will stop sharing and hand it over to Richard and Nate.
Thank you, Franco, for that lovely introduction. And we're really excited to share some of the work. And I would just want to say that it's definitely adapting and changing to the dilemmas that we face in the world is it's always about learning. It's always about collaborating, and there's no we don't come at this from a place of anything but humility, and we've had the opportunity to learn a lot of things along the way, and we're really wanted to have this presentation that we hope will foster like a really meaningful conversation about how do we deal honestly with really difficult problems related to climate change, and look at them both technically as well as the social side, the community side. I think that's when designers are at their best, is that we're trying to help build culture through good design that really understands the science and gets to work with great professional engineering practitioners like Franco that we've collaborated on some projects with. And basically, we're going to take you on a tour of some places that we've been around the country, where you can see people facing really difficult problems and trying to find solutions that address it. So I'll get started. The first thing is I think there's this tendency where we look at things and we say, well, what are we gonna do? Can anything be done? We look at our politics and we say, can anything be done there? We look at the state of the planet, the biodiversity decline, the increases in temperature through the greenhouse gases, and that the intensification of climate events, whether we're talking about fire, we're talking about heat, we're talking about floods or more intense storm events. Can we survive it? Can we deal with it? And I always think back to an earlier period, and this picture right here was taken in the mid 1930s and during the Dust Bowl. And it's an interesting time because the Dust Bowl is coincident with the Great Depression. So you have a country that is in economic collapse. You have these massive droughts that come through, and basically the soil, the American farming system in the Midwest is collapsing, and the soil is evaporating into the air, and these big black blizzards are forming that are just taking topsoil and just dumping it everywhere. And so it was terrifying, and it was one of the greatest points of displacement that occurred in American history. About 2.5 million people just had to get up and move. And so the thing that I take comfort in is that they organized a response. It did involve big government actions, but it also really involved empowering individuals and farmers of a different scale than we have today, really trying to upgrade their practices with conservation tillage. They developed these massive shelter belts that were basically planting forests that would hold topsoil, that would become a barrier to all this windblown soils and begin to anchor the soils in and really address these issues that were occurring across the Midwest states. And within 5 years, dramatic recovery had begun, and that was partly because the droughts began to end, but it was also because action was taken that really led to keeping the topsoil on site. And so this was green infrastructure at a scale like I've never actually witnessed in current times, but it showed, just like going to the moon, we can do big good things. And so I want people to, when they think about, the times that we're in, to not forget that we have this capacity. So let's talk about the big problems and how do we actually get at them. A lot of times, a big problem in practice is actually focusing on the issue that's most critical. And sometimes the headline issues even mask solutions. So somebody asks, what's the greatest threat to biodiversity? I think a lot of people would say it's climate change, or maybe they'd say it's chemicals. But the greatest threat to biodiversity is both terrestrial and in the oceans, is basically land disturbance. It's land disturbance caused by development. It's land disturbance caused by, say, large-scale agriculture, say cows. It's caused by aggressive fishing, where there's drag trawl fishing in the ocean, and it's basically disrupting the seabeds and the ecologies associated with it. So that's 30%. And then the next 23% is the exploitation of the kind of foods, that we're eating. So when you look at that, at least this according to the International Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, 53% of our biodiversity loss, more than half, is being driven by these two factors. Climate change, which is I'm terrified of. I'm terrified of how it's like moving, putting different pressures on ecosystems in terms of the temperature regimes, the precipitation regimes, creating hotter places that are making it very difficult to live. Its impact is smaller on biodiversity. On humans, it's big, but I just want to point out that it's a very sizable amount, but these are other things that we need to be looking at too, especially when we think about what are the solutions to reducing our impacts on the world. Next is chemicals, and then the next is invasive species displacing native indigenous systems, and then the rest is like wildfires or other miscellaneous issues. But just hold that in your minds when you think about what's going on in the world and how we need to think about addressing the problems. I also like to point out that places, when we settle them, when we develop them, we change them in fundamental ways. It may be almost unbelievable, but the most productive agricultural county in the US for 3 decades was Los Angeles County. That's no longer true, but it's fascinating when you think about how we change environments. It went from a dry, grassy, mostly chaparral landscape to being an ideal farming landscape. Then it got fully developed in terms of all the different industries that settled in. There's a lot of oil actually in Los Angeles. Of course, you know about the film and media industry, but it became a very, very big urbanized complex. And it can't go back to farming any more than it can go back to the ecosystems that it was. So it raises questions. How are we adapting? How are we confronting how we've transformed the landscape? And part of what you're going to hear in this talk is a plea that we really reconsider living closer together, thinking about density as being important, because we shouldn't be encroaching any further in the transformation of greenfield landscapes. Going to go into this a little bit more. Researching on soils. This makes sense for a landscape architect. I mean, we really get into the dirt, into the weeds. But it's important for thinking about things at a bigger scale as well. And so here, this is a picture of a soil profile I took in Nashville, where it's sitting on this bedrock limestone, and then you have this big soil profile above, and then you have the A horizon We know how soils typically form, through eroding bedrock and biological processes interacting from the top to make soils that became productive for all sorts of living systems. And soils are kind of like, if you look at soils, they're like this chemistry set for determining what kind of plants are going to grow, and that's going to determine what kind of insects are going to associate, and that's going to determine what kind of herbivores are going to come around, and finally your carnivores. And they move across these systems at various scales, but they're the template. And so as we look at things in detail, one of the first places I go to understand a landscape is the soils, and it's where I went when Nate and I worked on the LA River, but it's almost any place I go to, it tells you a lot about what the world is. Interestingly enough, the ecoregions that the EPA has aren't as fine as when you look at a soils map to really tell you what kind of species want to associate. They tend to be at this coarser grain of a larger scale. That same area that had these two typologies of ecotypes is much different when you look at it as a series of soils. And in a second, I'm going to kind of walk through that really quickly. What if we took just a little section and said, well, what is of this landscape, and asked what those soils were and what kind of plant communities and would you have? So if you were at the top of this hill, and this is a glaciated landscape around Massachusetts, it's thin and rocky at the top. So not so much moisture and not so much soil. You get further down, you get a little bit more soil coming in. You get a different profile in terms of the exposure, and you get a different series of plants. You move from high dry trees to some species that have a little bit more moisture, and then you start to move down into the bottomlands, and the soil is thick, and you have a different profile forming in terms of the kind of species that you get there. But you can see this kind of fineness to the landscape. You change the parameters of the soil, you change how much moisture is there, you change how much sun exposure, you get wet, you get a whole different profile of species. So it's very fine, and they're very kind of unique spaces and places when you look at it like that. So what happens when a territory of land that has all this fineness gets covered over with asphalts and concrete and roads, has buildings on it, has a landscape that different species could move across through, according to, where the resources were or where they were trying to run from, one thing to another. When it becomes so bifurcated block by block, then we know that the species, can't connect as much to one another. And the way that the hydrology moves through becomes much faster because it's an impervious system versus kind of soils that can absorb water. And so the thing that I say when people talk about restoring, like they have a property and they're like, we want it to be natural and we want it to restore the ecology. And I'm like, that's great. We can make this small patch support more life and biodiversity and have ecosystem services. But you have to realize that changing the entire context has changed microclimate, has changed what habitat have access to place, have changed what moisture comes through the watershed, and the chemistry of all of your surroundings has profoundly changed. And so when we look at the urban domain, what we need to begin to ask ourselves is what is the ecology we can have that works best for humans and works best for keeping us together in density and having exposure to nature, because we can't wind back the clock when we've made changes this profound. And this is the kind of world that, I love finding ways to make life happen in this. This is actually a block and a half from where I live. I mean, this is the soil profile. It's full of utilities that keep the soil, warm and hot and cold. It's full of debris. So the question is, can I make it better? Yes, we can make it better, but let's not pretend it can be the original ecosystem it was. I love showing this image that nature is adaptable and it can deal with adversity. This is on the Olympic Peninsula. This tree is called the tree of life. But one of the important things that I like to point out is that roots are more about the horizontal, where they can get the oxygen and the nutrients. And so it's not just how deep the soil is, that really matters less. It means a whole lot more in terms of being able to spread out and have a green space to work with. So now just to jump way up at a different scale, as climate change is impacting us, back in 2013, we worked with HRNA to ask the economic questions about how this climate changing world is going to affect the Northeast. And also Franco through E-Design Dynamics was also with us on this team, and Penn Praxis. But we looked at how increased flooding would begin to affect vulnerable communities along the Northeast corridor. And what we found is that those who were relatively well off in their economic profile, in the upper tier of the economic profile, they don't need to, if their house encounters damage, if they no longer receive insurance, they can still cope, and they'll probably stay. But the middle class will tend to move and kind of divest from a region, and also the same thing will tend to happen to manufacturing and industries. The more storms, more floods come, the more that these groups tend to remove themselves from that factor of harm. And this will be important when Nate talks about NATEC risks along the Delaware. But the worst thing that has happened, and what we call this kind of a great gentrifier, is that so the very wealthiest have the resources to stay in these communities, and then the very poorest who don't have the resources to relocate or move, they are kind of trapped with fewer resources at hand as these places depopulate if we don't find ways to properly adapt. And so what I kind of think of this as a great strangling that's occurring. And we think of, climate disasters almost in apocalyptic terms, just like in this painting here. But what's insidious about climate change is it's more a strangling. Our resources become more difficult to afford. As people divest from certain regions, government resources dry up, parks and schools disappear, and the cost of things goes up as it's harder to grow food in places that traditionally supported food. All these things, slowly begin to create inexorable harms year by year by year. So it's a case of basically, I feel like a python strangling us, because it's not coming right at us. It's just a slow effect. And so I think, we need to encourage ourselves to think about renewable resources that we can truly connect ourselves to, just like every other species has done. We've taken a very novel approach by attaching ourselves to finite resources. As things become more finite, they become more expensive. And also, in addition to that, in terms of our energy, it's a more finite energy supply that comes from fossil fuels, is also something that is poisoning our planet through the addition of greenhouse gases, as well as volatile organics on the ground. So philosophically, we're trying more and more as a practice to think in circular terms, to think about where we get our materials, what is the footprint of our communities, and how can we be more local and more connected in terms of how we put things together. So I want to move from there, with that philosophy in mind, and talk about, well, why it's so hard. And one of the hardest projects I could think to talk about was Ile de Jean Charles community, the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw tribe, had the terrible decision to make of applying to resettle from what was their community land, which had been their home, and through progressive hurricanes had experienced significant floods and the community eroding year by year by year by year. And through a national natural resources grants, they had secured a grant for a relocation, and they've been termed, and they found this a very difficult appellation as climate refugees. And I know they viewed that term as pejorative. It became a kind of a media sensation that we're seeing the first community in the United States that's having to relocate due to climate change induced effects. And I know that some of what's been put out there, they've said is don't think of us like that. Think of us as pioneers and leaders in a solution. But it is a very painful process to ask people to relocate. And I think a lot of, the scientific community has been seeing a lot of places that we don't see any other option but to relocate. But I think we have to understand and empathize with what it really means, and why there's a lot of environmental racism associated with having to make those choices, because the underlying conditions that cause this community to have to leave are resultant from the oil and gas industry, the decline of Louisiana's wetlands, partly through industrial processes. And so they became victims of an economy that they really didn't have a lot of participation in. So we were part of a team that looked at what the resettlement would be, hired through the Louisiana Office of Community Development. And we thought this was going to be a fulfilling enterprise to have a part in this work that really is thinking about, okay, we're doing real adaptation. This is a part of the future to grab onto. But the more that we've learned through the process is really how tough it's going to be if we have to do this all over the place. And so I think there's a lot of lessons that we all need to learn from each other as to the best ways to do that. So when we began this process, the first thing that we did was we went to the island. We met with the community. There'd been a engagement process that had been going on for over a year. And we wanted to know, how did the community live? What was day-to-day life like? And what did where would they be moving to? How could we preserve as much of the way that they lived as possible, especially because this is an indigenous community, and this is indigenous land. So we looked at the marina was a big part of the community's life. This was a rural community. They preferred, their contact with nature. They were surrounded by a giant levee that was still not high enough to keep the floodwaters out. But water in nature was a big part of how this community lived. Is very spread out. It's not very dense, which again, I'm advocating for density most of the time. But I felt like we had to understand what this community was about to justly serve them. And so that led to these kind of investigations that I think we all need to take when we work in these places and we ask people to do hard things. So we looked at the dimensions of their lots. We looked at, well, what were the characters of it? How did people use their land so that we could come up with things that would respond to that. We looked at the landscape and really appreciated why this place meant so much to them, and that it's not really replaceable, and also saw the adversity and all the adaptation that had taken place over the years trying to deal with high floodwaters. It's really quite traumatic. But when we looked at it in detail, the base flood elevation was 16 feet. And the island here, the highest points were at 6 feet, except for the elevated houses. And so the location to what's called New Isle, near Houma, Louisiana, was a place that would be above the base flood elevation, the 1% flood risk, and we could actually locate homes above the 500-year flood. So that's what we did. We came to this site and we asked ourselves, how could we make it as close to a lifestyle that Ile de Jean Charles had? And so, it was about an hour from Ile de Jean Charles, and this is its kind of locations to other places. It's a rural place, about 500 acres. It has some bayou cut-throughs through it in terms of water passing by, and in terms of the scale of the land, you can see on the left the Isle, and you can see the New Isle community site. We had to take the community through a series of options. I want to move or I want to stay. If you stayed, we had to be honest about resources by the county could no longer be supplied. They were running out of the capacity to do that. You could receive a cash buyout, or you could move to a new location, to the new community. So we tried to lay out as many options as possible. One of the innovations that were developed was that because this was indigenous land, that they would have rights to continue to have the Isle as their land, whereas in a traditional buyout scenario, the land that you give goes in trust to the government, and you get a new home instead of that. In this case, we were looking at, because of indigenous rights and considerations, that it wasn't the same thing. And that was really a novel and innovative thought that came through in the process. We spent a lot of time asking, again, how this landscape could be more like the one that they had. And so I have to be honest, it's hard to say that we gave them something exactly like what they had. We didn't. But what we did was we developed a land development profile that looked a lot like what they had on the island. And so we imagined two futures, a future for the Isle as it fills with water over time to remain a fishing and nature destination, as well as a place for ceremony for the community. And the New Isle community is this series of homes that we took the careful measurements at the start of the project of like what was the size of a house, what was the scale, what was the yard that they had, and replicated that in this development. We also did things like we connected the water that runs through the site in ways that water would be proximate but environmentally buffered. But it had a little bit of the sense of place that they came from, as well as renewable energy resources through a PV solar field. And so 23 families relocated, and they're safer today of the 27. And so it was a success in those terms, but I just have to tell you, it was so fraught in terms of an experience for a community to give up their connection to the place that generations had lived in. So moving into Caño Martin Peña, very similar in terms of a landscape that's frequently inundated. This was it in the 1930s. This is the Caño is the channel here, and it was surrounded by mangrove. Within a few decades, when sugarcane farming collapsed, mainly during that same period of the Depression, a lot of farmers settled here who they had no home, they had no formal title to the land, and they built this huge informal community that had very poor services and was really, considered kind of not relevant to the rest of San Juan. Yet they did the construction jobs and they did a lot of the service sector jobs at very low wages and went home to places that had very poor services. And so our work was to find a way for this community to get the infrastructure services they deserved and to minimize the flooding threat, and also to let people have agency over the kind of life and place they wanted to live. One of the fascinating things about Caño Martin Peña is that it has been under a planning process that was formed through community action for over 20 years. And they've actually had more than 600 relocations where people have chosen to move because they have trust in the planning system. And that has only come through year after year after year of engagement and faith that people are working not to erode or dissolve a community, but to find a better future for it. But it is a community that lives with a lot of issues from induced by the flooding. It's caused terrible air quality. There's a lot of sanitary sewage overflow events. A lot of people have experienced flooding. And we were doing this process in the middle of COVID. And so we were organizing meetings outdoors. Also, the climate change, it is, they're getting more intense rainfall events, but net less rainfall. They're also have 50% hotter nights than they did in the 1960s. And bringing to the community the science that the flooding was only going to get worse was a very difficult message, as well as trying to figure out to find the best level of ecological restoration of the mangroves, knowing that we can't restore it to what it was, but we can certainly improve the water quality. So getting the community to buy into climate change, into these factors of sea level rise, and understanding that continued relocations would have to happen, having those very honest conversations, they took a long time, and they took a lot of engagement. And it also led us to really think about ways of creating new housing options that I think hadn't been conventionally thought of. But one of the things is that even if we had money for everybody to move with the standard rates that people give based on housing value or minimum relocation costs, there's not that housing available across the island. There's not that housing available anywhere. We have a terrible housing shortage, which again, Nate will talk about on the LA River. But what this led to is we need a new level of design and planning engagement. And I think that the Caño Martin Peña system really shows a way of doing it, of planning with communities for extended periods to come up with novel solutions that fit their space, because they contribute incredibly to the economy of San Juan and greater Puerto Rico. They live in close density. They live with small means, but they give back a lot, and they've been committed to this community since the 1930s, almost 100 years. And I think these kind of more nuanced relocations and adaptations are ways of tackling the problem. And we certainly need to make housing and density part of the way that we address the solution. So this was really a kind of choreography that we developed, where we looked at the housing, the infill blocks. We looked at how to make the infrastructure possible in terms of roads that could actually receive fire trucks and service, as well as to put in the stormwater and the electrical utilities. E-Design Dynamics, Franco worked with us on developing numerous compound storm events that looked at sea level rise in those scenarios, and ways of coming up with, I'd call, hybrid nature-based solutions, ones that incorporated both relatively big moves with levees and pumps, but also ways of making sure that the water quality was preserved, integrating it with the environmental restoration plan to add mangroves back and to clear the hydrology of the channel. And so these scenarios, we had to test them. When they failed, we had to test them with sea level rise. But I think at the end of the day, what we found ourselves is like, well, when people are living this close together and they're this part of an economy and there's nowhere else to go, maybe there's more cost to consider than just the issue of, yes, it's expensive infrastructure, because it becomes very expensive when people's lives fall apart through being separated from their community and all the social and environmental costs that causes as well. So this is a little bit about how we envisioned a process where we would have new housing within the community so that people were relocating within the community. Then we could put the infrastructure in, and then we could move into more complete ecological restoration for the plan. And so this plan is actually underway. The Army Corps of Engineers is working through clearing out the channel and setting up what will be the mangrove restoration zone. And then the infrastructure has begun in Buena Vista Santurce to begin to separate the combined sewer and to make sure that illegal sewage discharges are no longer happening within the community. So I'm going to hand it off to Nate to talk about designing in the era of pre-existing conditions in Los Angeles.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, so I'm going to start off talking about the LA River Master Plan in Los Angeles, and then come back to Philadelphia to end and talk about some of our work on the Delaware River. So starting here with the LA River, 51 miles in LA County and Southern California. And so just a few things to know about the river for those who aren't as familiar, who have only seen the images of the concrete channel. In those 51 miles, it drops 800 feet, which is about how much the Mississippi River drops over its full length. And also as you go up into the San Gabriel Mountains in the top of the watershed, some of the tributaries that are joining into the river are dropping almost 7,000 feet. And so you have water really rushing through this watershed on its way to the Pacific. On top of that, you have a lot of variability in rain. So the mountains are grabbing rain with up to 36 inches up at Mount Wilson, whereas downtown LA, looking at closer to 15 inches, which is more what we typically think about the LA environment. But you do see these really big rain events higher up in the watershed. And then also speaking of variability, there's annual precipitation variability, so dry years and wet years, and that has a big impact on both flooding and as we know most recently, the fire risk in LA. But there's also, within any given year, there's also this kind of seasonal pattern, broadly speaking, of dry summers and wet winters when larger rain events can occur off the Pacific. And within this really dynamic watershed, when we first joined this project, one of the kind of stories and characters that really attracted us was the steelhead trout. And to talk a little bit about its life cycle, it moves between, it's anadromous, it moves between the ocean and the river throughout its various phases. And so, it's really about these two different lives. And so, with the LA River, there's been a lot of talk and interest about, this idea of trying to return the trout and be able to allow it to move up and through this watershed again. And when we look back, this is one of the oldest photos that we have of the LA River before complete urbanization, although you can see it's already well started. That this river was vegetated and did have this kind of low flow. Some seasons it dried up, but historically fish were able to use the river to move up into the mountains. And also, apologize, this photo's a little grainy, but this is showing a flood condition, but you can also see here the way that the LA River historically had these big pulses and would move really widely across its floodplain, which allowed fish to move in larger groups between the mountains and the ocean as well. And so, going back to historical maps, during certain years, much of LA could actually be considered wetlands. And so you see these historical wetlands that came out of the mountains for the tributaries, but also in the lighter blue, a really large floodplain for the LA River. So the river from year to year sometimes would shift by miles left and right when these big pulses would make it bust out of its embankments and move outward. And going from that moment in 1870, we all know about LA now and the rapid urbanization that really transformed this environment and this larger ecosystem that the trout had existed in. And so areas, this is another great historical photo from 32, where you can see the still meandering low flow of the river. Today, we have these very straightened, long concrete strips, and you'll see that little dark line down the middle of the concrete. If you're able to see my mouse, oops, sorry, is a kind of low flow. So the last bit of water that's moving down at the bottom of the channel. And so this is what the river often looks like now. It's not an environment, inherently hospitable to fish. And I want to talk a little bit about why it's concrete and some of the challenges in thinking about restoring a river in an urban environment like this. So why is the LA River concrete? It's the history of flooding, largely, and that water moves more quickly through channels that have less friction, that are smoother and straighter, allowing floodwaters to move out more quickly and reducing risk. And so it was really historic floods that happened in the 1930s and extreme damage that led the Army Corps to come in and channelize the full extent of the river. And so there are kind of two pressures that are looking at changing the river. One is really about that low flow and creating habitat conditions in the small amount of water that are at the bottom of the channel. And maybe that's represented by these bottom two images. So the percentages on the right are showing the impact that vegetation has on flood capacity. And so just changing that low flow just reduces capacity maybe 5%. But when you start looking at vegetating the entire river, you see that capacity cut in half. And with that kind of, working that math through, one of the things we did very early on this project was to understand, well, what would it look like to widen the LA River to give it the space it needs for proper restoration? And so this kind of idea of a 3 to 7 times wider to meet the current capacity, the flood capacity, was something we came up with. So if you look at the middle one, widening by 5 times, the kind of analysis here showed that we'd be displacing potentially up to 60,000 people that have, that have been moved up against the edge of the river, but also a ton of infrastructure. So freeways, railroad transmission line, bridges, lots of critical infrastructure that would need to be relocated or rebuilt. A really, kind of gargantuan effort given the conditions around the river today. And I was mentioning the people that would be displaced by widening, and it was really the human story of the LA River that we were kind of most taken with. And there's over 1 million people that live within a mile of the river, and over 25% of Californians live within an hour drive. And it's just an incredible amount of people that this is in their backyard. And as part of the engagement, we were able to host a series of events actually in the channel, doing movies and other public events. This is one of them here. And related to that story, the CalEnviro screen, for those who haven't worked in California, is an environmental index that looks at environmental conditions across the state and ranks them based on a percentage. And so these areas in red are in the worst environmental conditions in California, so the highest percentiles. And that was really our focus. You see the LA River flows through a lot of those communities. And we really wanted the impacts of transformation on the river to start there. One of the things as this project played out over several years was, COVID started. Richard mentioned it in a previous project, and I'll flip back and forth between those again. There was a real direct correlation between these pre-existing environmental challenges and areas where COVID had the most impact on deaths and COVID cases, and just again speaks to the currentness of the challenges these communities are facing. So another major issue in LA that grabs a lot of the headlines is housing. And while the river itself and the riverbed is not an appropriate place for housing, we did look a lot at lands around it, and an awareness that improving the river may also have impacts on housing affordability. And so these two things graphed here in blue, you're seeing the rate of homelessness, percentage increase. So in the kind of 10 years leading up to this planning effort, there was a 63% increase in homelessness. And kind of at a similar time and a similar rate of increase, you see affordable housing gap in LA growing into the over 500,000 units of housing missing. And I know it's only continued to go up since 2019 when this was done. And I'm not getting into detail on this today. One of the responses to this was thinking about and in proposing a land bank. And one of another analyses we did as part of this process was looking at gentrification and a method coming out of UC Berkeley to look at census data and understand where new parks might have an impact on gentrification and where rent increases could really impact people. And trying to get ahead of that and thinking about when we locate and do improvements along the river, can affordable housing be planned and built in advance or in tandem with that, to try to minimize some of the potential displacement. All right, pivoting back to flooding. This is just a juxtaposition of a shot on the lower river in a dry and wet condition to really get at this point of extremes. And so often I think the CFS on the LA River is as little as 5,000, but in major flood events, it can jump up to 100,000 CFS, cubic feet per second, during a 1% storm event, which is more water than is going over Niagara Falls regularly. To give you a sense of the volume change here, a person in the bottom for scale. And so despite the whole river being channelized to manage or reduce flood risk, there's significant sections of it that don't meet current capacity. So don't meet a 50-year or 100-year storm event. And a lot of those are located where the river moves around the Santa Monica Mountains, kind of in the middle there, north of downtown, but also significant stretches in the San Fernando Valley. And this was a real surprise to us. Some of these areas haven't seen floods historically, but there is real risk here of overtopping, and people who don't have that historic memory of flooding or don't anticipate it happening could be really surprised and impacted. On top of these existing flood risks, we all know, of course, about the challenges of climate change, and heat and fire are, maybe the most immediate concerns, but there's been this kind of growing understanding in LA about the other big one, which is the megastorm, a really massive flood event. And I think actually over the next couple of days, I don't know if it's going to be a big one, but I know there's something like 18 or 20 inches predicted for LA as one of these atmospheric rivers comes off the Pacific. And studies are showing that these events are increasing in duration and both intensity with climate change. And so what can we do about it, the solution space? So working with Geosyntec on this project, on all the engineering. One of the initial starting points was reducing imperviousness throughout the watershed. And this aligns with a lot of other great planning that's happening in LA County around water quality and water supply. And one of the goals they have is by 2037, to reduce to have a 28% reduction across the watershed. And so one of the things we studied early on was, okay, if these reductions do happen, might there be less flood impacts in the future? So for those of you not familiar with hydrograph, this is just showing a spot in the Glendale Narrows where the existing capacity is 34,000, which is quite low. And what you'll see here on these 4 lines, they're showing the baseline, the current flooding that happens in a 48-hour period, and then the reduction in imperviousness. And what you see is in a really small rain event, there is a significant impact when you get around like 5 or 10,000 CFS. But when you jump up to the top, this really has almost no impact at all on flooding, unfortunately. And this was one of the real kind of challenges that we had to explain throughout this process, because I think one of the broad understandings amongst the public and a lot of other actors in the county was that this reduction in imperviousness might be more significant. And to show this in another couple ways, this is another hydrograph, same spot on the river. There's an animation on the LA River Master Plan website if you'd like to see this kind of played out. I'm going to show it just here in stills for simplicity, and then a section below showing the channel and the water level. And so in a 2-year storm event, this section of the channel is managing it quite well. When you jump up to a 100-year event, 1% chance happening in a given year, anywhere that's pink is where overtopping is occurring. So flooding would be happening in adjacent neighborhoods. And so, very concerning. We haven't seen this storm event since the channel has been built, but it very well could occur, and there's increasing likelihood that it may. And then back to that hydrograph from before, and zooming in on this really problematic section at a peak event here. So on the far left, you'll see the baseline imperviousness, and then what different changes to the channel, to the watershed have on the flood risk. So using that 28% impervious reduction, we don't see a lot of change. This next one here adds refurbishment. So I didn't get into this detail, but this section of the river actually is soft bottom. So it does have some vegetation growing in it. And while it's wonderful for biodiversity, it actually does impact the flooding here. And so refurbishment wasn't removing that, but was managing it more actively than it currently is to increase capacity. That had some benefit. But then lastly, a much more structural solution was a bypass tunnel that actually cuts underneath the mountains and skips this section of channel that isn't at capacity. And you see this finally starts really, all of these added up starts having an impact. And this is something we see in our work everywhere, that there's never one solution. It's often a combination of solutions that is needed. I'm going to transition from flooding here just to talk a little bit about ecosystems and fire, and then finish out with a little bit of some of the other solutions the plan brought about. So looking at terrestrial ecosystems and some of the charismatic fauna up in the mountains, the puma and mule deer. We know these are amazing creatures, but they require really large habitats. And we did an analysis looking at a lot of different existing habitat areas, buffers, linkages, and unprotected areas to do a kind of analysis. And you can really see, a lot of, the existing habitat areas are up in the mountains and are very constrained by urbanization. And there's a direct correlation between areas of these valued ecosystems and where ecosystem management's needed and historical fires. And this map is from 2017, so it doesn't include the most recent fires that happened. But, there's this data set that looks at historic fire occurrences. There's various data sets and overlays that look at fire risk, and we largely know where these are going to occur. And it's really the challenge of, as Richard noted earlier, of implementing the change that's needed to reduce that risk. And so for the LA River, there were a couple touch points where the river flowed closer to the mountains or open spaces where parks and improvements there needed to be conscious of defensible space and other design guidelines to reduce fire risk. Kind of related to fire is heat. And maybe less the map here, I wanted to note, the extreme heat is already an issue in Los Angeles, and into the future, by end of century in the San Fernando Valley, which is the upper part of the river here, looking at as many as 126 days of the year where temperatures are exceeding 95 degrees. And so thinking of cooling was also another major element and driver of the LA River, and getting people to open spaces and vegetated spaces adjacent to it. And so I'm not getting into all these topics, but there were a lot of different challenges that this comprehensive planning effort was trying to touch. And for each of these, we had a goal. So reducing flood risk, improving access to open space, supporting ecosystems, affordable housing, et cetera, clean water. And for each of these, there was this sort of detailed analysis that tried to really evaluate where those needs are most acute within the county, and then also drilling into the river relative to that larger need, so that as sites come available for new projects, prioritization process can happen to really understand where the biggest impact could be had across all these issues. And so the plan itself, again, a lot of this info is online, and would recommend you look deeper if you haven't. But it was a 3-year plus community engagement process. Again, I mentioned 1 million people living near the river. So we used a lot of different methods to reach all those people, a youth summit, open houses, getting things into local newspapers for all the different municipalities along the river. And then really key was a community partnership. So working with existing groups that are already doing good work and partnering with them to move things forward. That led to this public works event in the river, for example, and also really important conversations with indigenous groups in the area. We built on past planning, so just showing this, we started with all the existing projects that we knew were in the pipeline, and then really thought, well, where can we add? What can we add to all of this that's out there? And so looking at need, as I mentioned before, site analysis with opportunity, and then cadence is really thinking about the equitable distribution of amenities. And so some projects were site-based, really specific. Others were system-based and required thinking about multiple sites working in concert. But broadly, they fit into these 6 categories, this kit of parts. So trails and access gateways, which is really about connectivity and getting people to the river. Crossings and platforms, so places where the river, where there wasn't land around the river for open space, and there were important connections that could be made. The river is often a barrier, just like a highway or a rail line. Floodplain reclamation in the few places where there are sites adjacent to the river where displacement isn't required. Channel modifications, which are really important, and connecting back to the story of the fish, the steelhead trout, there's currently efforts moving forward to look at that little strip of blue down the middle and how it can be redesigned to create these small pockets for habitat to give the trout a chance, but not to completely alter the configuration of the channel and its flood capacity. Diversions, which I mentioned before, trying to get water out of the channel, and then working on land assets adjacent to the river. And then bringing this down to the human level, we had a set of common elements that were really about making this a hospitable place on hot days, on rainy days, and could provide the needs for these community members that were living around the river. And so there are a couple, I want to show a couple specific design projects, and then I'm going to jump over to Philadelphia. Up on the upper river, this was actually a shot I showed earlier where historically the river jumped out of its banks at this curve. There's a park here, and one of the things we proposed was a side channel, essentially, that could be built along the back end of the park that would not have water in it all the time. It would be more like a dry arroyo, but in flood events, if you're able to see in the lower right corner here, it would still serve that function of floodplain historically and reduce some of the flood pressure in this area. And then more dramatically on the lower river, this was an area where there's a really large demand for more open space, but the space itself didn't exist. We used the space above the river itself. And so here showing the idea of these platform parks, connecting these communities across the river and bringing much needed community assets. And so I'm going to jump now to Philadelphia, which is where Richard and I are based today. We also have an LA office, to the Climate Resilient Communities Project. And I want to begin with this image. So I've tilted us here, so I apologize for everyone's probably really confused, but Philadelphia is on the upper right. And I love that this image is from the space station, and it just, really makes that point that Philadelphia is connected, via Delaware Bay to the Atlantic Ocean. And through that, all the maritime industry and all of that, but now the challenges of sea level rise. And Philadelphia has been spared recently. We weren't heavily impacted, or as heavily impacted, I should say, by Sandy as Boston and New York were, but are still very vulnerable. And as part of this project, we toured a lot of this area and see a lot of sites like this where we have extreme intensive industrial uses, many of them petrochemical, pressed right up to the water's edge. This is on a high tide day, no flooding here, but just literally 1 or 2 feet between the water level and these really large industrial facilities. We see this is a public park in Marcus Hook, where similarly it's already starting to see regular flooding and losing some of its function. There's areas where communities are pressed right up against oil refineries and industrial corridors. And we're also seeing a lot of change. So there's a lot of old brownfield sites that are being converted right now to warehouses and are being built right up against the water's edge without a lot of consideration for climate change or community benefits. And in this wild example, there's tree planting literally happening where the roots are down in this in the tide zone. And I'm sure if I came back to this site, this was right after install, many of them have probably died. And then further up to Philadelphia, some of you may know about this, but this is the former PES refinery site currently being redeveloped by Hilco for warehouses. So this is a really massive, I would say 1,800 acre site that's currently being redeveloped in a floodplain. And it was really this intersection of existing industrial pressure, industrial changes, and flood risk that led us into this project with the Clean Air Council through funding with William Penn Foundation. So for this project, we partnered with Drexel, working with Franco and one of his PhD students. We had a community and technical advisory panel. The community advisory panel was really active throughout the project. I'll talk a little more about that. And then we also partnered with the Center for Progressive Reform in sharing some of our data for a report they were working on. This project had 3 phases: analyze and envision, advancing local projects, and then this kind of longer term planning and advocacy that's needed to prepare for the larger projects that are needed. And throughout this, Clean Air Council was doing reviewing industrial permits as they sort of came online in the project area. So focusing us in now geographically, north is up now, so Philadelphia at the top right. We focused on the neighborhoods of Grays Ferry, Eastwick, Chester, Trainer, and Marcus Hook. And these are all neighborhoods where Clean Air Council had existing on the ground engagement with communities and past work, so we could build on those connections. But they're also communities that all deal with flooding and have existing industrial areas. And this process really began with the community, and we took the data that was out there that we and literally just came to parks, to community centers, put it out on tables, and had conversations with people about what the data showed, what they were seeing. Heard a lot about basement flooding and things like that, street flooding, where it wasn't being shown in the maps. And some of the key takeaways from that process. 6 of the 7 communities had really extreme flooding that they were dealing with, and residents had, in some communities, recurring issues. But a couple of other things that came out that we weren't quite as much expecting, but one of them was heat. And in many cases, residents, that was really their primary concern, even if they maybe had dealt with flooding before. They were really seeing the impacts of heat on their communities. And then additionally was the need for open space and connectedness. A lot of these communities were looking to have more places to go outside and experience nature. And at the end of this, we came back out to a lot of different community events and got input on the final results and what we could move forward with. So this was the kind of basic equation that we brought out to talk about this set of issues, and it all sits under this umbrella of NATEC, which is a new term for us, but it's defined as natural hazard triggered technological accidents. And it's really emerged out of Katrina and Harvey and some of the other recent flood events in the Gulf Coast, where you saw flooding then causing industrial accidents that have bigger impacts. And so this is all made worse by natural hazards, and really bringing this message to communities that they have existing risk, and we should be mad about and upset about that and look for change, but the risk is actually increasing due to climate change specifically. So to start with industrial risk, for those of you who've worked with the EPA a lot, I know this very well may be changing, but part of our challenge was to jump in and understand the regulatory frameworks that are out there. There are many, and we had to go to a lot of different places to find the data to understand the existing contamination in the air, soil, and water. And so each of these boxes that's kind of squared was a spatial data set that we were able to then pull all together to really understand the footprint of contamination in industry. And so that's what this is, that map. And I can't get into detail with all the legend, but looking at active industrial sites, petroleum infrastructure, and then legacy brownfields. And you'll see in each of these communities a huge density of those. And then the residential areas being shown in yellow. So it's really that proximity of industry and residential and the water that we were focusing on. And so, you know, we already have existing industrial accidents in our region that we can point to, some quite recent, past oil spills on the Delaware, chemical spills, and natural hazards are now this additional ingredient that can cause additional accidents. So I want to start with flood risk, and then we'll talk briefly about heat. And so our region deals with all four types of flood risk: pluvial, the urban stormwater flooding; fluvial, coming from the creeks and rivers; coastal, being the tidal and storm surge; and then groundwater pushing up from below. And it's really compound flooding is the really unique challenge in this region, where you've got potentially the coastal and fluvial meeting. And so you've got water coming down tributaries, meeting water pushing up from the Delaware Bay in a surge event. And the potential for those two things compounding and being worse than either would be in isolation. Showing here some flooding. One of the communities that has the most recurrent flooding in Philadelphia is in Eastwick. I believe this was a few years back, maybe from Ida. But you get direct, flooding to homes, but also the community is shut down as streets and other critical infrastructure become inaccessible. So this first map here just looks at the FEMA floodplains. So the darker blue being the 0.2%, the 500-year event, and the lighter blue, the 1%. This is NOAA's simulation for a Category 3 storm, which roughly tracks with the same kind of spatial footprint of the 500-year event. And so Philadelphia has never been, to our knowledge, directly hit by a Category 3 storm. So this is not necessarily an event we've ever experienced, but this, for those of you not familiar with the NOAA data, really showing the worst case possible scenario where inundation could occur, but really significant along the shoreline in Chester, Trainer, Marcus Hook, and really full inundation in Eastwick, and then just some minor areas in Grays Ferry where the former refinery site was. So transitioning to current air temperature, we are expecting air temperature to increase in this area, so that will become a continued challenge. But these communities are mostly all in areas where you're already seeing urban heat island impacts. So this is a data set from DVRPC that looked at a few hot days and the variation from the coolest and hottest temperatures. And so we see some areas in Grays Ferry and down in Chester having almost a 15-degree difference than areas that are cooler elsewhere, and are cooler than the average, I should say. And so this was really one of the drivers and things we also heard a lot in the community. They want more trees, they want more cooling centers, they want more access to air conditioning. So now looking into a little bit more of future challenges and projecting out sea level rise. And for this, there's obviously the extreme condition and projecting further out to 2140. We really focused around 2080 and looking at, more the average amount of sea level rise. And so for that, we're looking closer to, I believe it's around 20 to 30 inches by the end, by 2080, so looking about 50 years out, and really use that as a guide for some of our design work. So just showing that mapped here, the NOAA data with sea level rise. And then I wanted to speak to some specific modeling we got to do with Drexel as our partner. So this work was done with Franco and Nirjan Adhikari, a PhD student at the Sustainable Water Resource Engineering Laboratory. And we worked with them to look at modeling past storm events of record. So rather than looking at some extreme, unlikely, or currently unlikely future storm that's never occurred before, we picked 3 past storms and added sea level rise effects to see what might occur when those storms happen again. They worked with hydraulic inputs from gauges in the Delaware and Schuylkill rivers, as well as as well as other tributaries that had gauge information. And then they developed a HEC-MS grid to look at precipitation, over the larger area. And precipitation wasn't factored in, I think, in detail. So it was really just focused on the tributary flows that are then coming down into these communities. And we also worked with the best topographic data we had for the bathymetry of the river and the upland areas and building footprints to model these future storm events. So these are the results spatialized. The 3 storms were merged, just they all had slightly different kind of drivers to see what the impacts would be. So the lighter blue is the storms as modeled, so where flooding may have occurred when these storms happened in the past. And then the darker blue shows the impact of 2 feet of sea level rise, so that kind of medium-term outlook. And you see, certain areas, the airport maybe jump out first, but when you really zoom into these communities, these impacts are significant. And looking at that in graph form, maybe focusing on Hurricane Sandy, which was actually the largest storm impact in Philadelphia to date. So starting with the baseline, each of these colors of blue show different depths of flooding. So maybe drawing attention to very extreme flooding, which is 2 feet or more. So the baseline in our region saw about 1,500 acres of land flooded. When you add 2 feet of sea level rise, that doubles. When you add 4 feet, looking more into the next century, we're looking at almost tripling, quadrupling the area of impact. And so we looked at this across all these different storms. And storms may also get worse. So these are somewhat conservative in that sense. And this all leads, as I mentioned earlier, to increased community risk and this idea of NATEC, which are natural disasters triggering technological accidents. So what can we do about it? Better management of these natural hazards, adapting to climate change, and chemical accident prevention and preparedness response. I mentioned this earlier, for those who want to look deeper into this, the Gulf Coast is really kind of leading the research on this topic, but Hurricane Katrina led to several accidents where the net impact was much bigger than just the storm alone due to chemicals and other things that were released during the flood. And so I'm now overlaying the industrial data from earlier, all the brownfield industrial sites with those modeled storm impacts. And I'm just going to zoom into a couple places to kind of give a bit more detail of what this looks like. So these are Google Earth images overlaid with that flood data. And so the lighter blue, again, is the baseline event, which in this case, you see a few of these petroleum holding tanks are impacted, but when you add that 2 feet, it expands, the area of impact increases greatly, as well as the movement up creeks where it can then impact residential communities. This has been looking up in Eastwick, where again, the flood risk currently is really, really high, but as sea level rise is added on, more and more industrial facilities and residential areas get pulled into that. And to wrap up with the recommendations from this project, and then we'll be excited to have some discussion afterward. There were sort of 3 scales of recommendations. So the finest scale being community-based social resilience projects, regional infrastructure, and then policy. I'm going to skip through these quick. One thing we did was across these communities, just identifying, there are these shared kind of typologies that have their own unique exposure and risk assessments, but also opportunities. So we looked at residential neighborhoods, commercial corridors, cultural clusters, linear infrastructure, and creek corridors as being typologies that really needed their own unique solution set. Kind of more broadly, this diagram on the top really talks about this this pathway to climate adaptation. And every community is in a different starting place. So some need to build social capital and awareness. Others are ready to plan and fund adaptation. As we know, implementation itself takes a long time, a lot of effort and resources. And then, after the thing's built, it's not done. It has to be maintained. It has to be updated as climate continues to change. And so, again, this toolkit, so the Community Resilience Toolkit was more of these smaller components: green stormwater infrastructure, cooling centers, waterfront access, tree planting, shade, splash pads, building retrofits, temporary barriers, more environmental modeling, and pavement reductions. Going up to the regional scale, looking at levees and raised shorelines, improved connectivity, centralizing information, nature-based solutions, and raising infrastructure. So these are really interventions that require multiple municipalities, counties, even state and federal agencies to be involved. And then policy recommendations. Broadly, just I'll go through these: emergency management, staying in place, which really talks about this similar topic of anti-displacement measures and fair and safe housing, urban infrastructure improvements dealing with green stormwater, and then specifically industrial sites and trying to increase their resilience, but also ensure that they're doing more for their communities. And then lastly, just to show kind of how this lands, so that we're finishing this report in the next couple of months. So this will be out in the public soon. But for each community, we're kind of now downsizing all this. So there's the full plan, but each community will also have one of these micro plans that goes through this sort of same set of data sets, but in a more granular way, and then also with recommendations. So really gearing into where some of those local project types I mentioned a second ago can happen in those communities, where the larger regional moves need to be made to look at barriers and larger nature-based solutions, and then specific policies that build off what current municipality and county governments are doing. So I think that, yeah, that's the end of our slides. So again, yeah, the 4 projects we looked at: Climate Resilient Communities Project here in Philadelphia, the Los Angeles River Master Plan in LA,
Caño Martin Peña, and
Puerto Rico.
In Puerto Rico, and Ile de Jean Charles in Louisiana. And I think when you just hold it all together, the things that we're seeing is engaging community and culture is just as essential to resilience as it is understanding the science and putting together policies that actually work and hold people, communities, and economies together. And just that broad share that we've seen now it's had so many profound learning moments for us as a design and planning practice. But the learning curve is steep, and look forward to having conversations with all of you about it. Thank you.
Thank you guys. That was a really inspirational set of projects and choices and decisions that you presented to us. So we've got a lot of questions that have added up. I mean, just on that last point you were saying, Richard, I mean, my sort of take home, started with what early on when you were your first slide, when you were showing the biodiversity impacts and how important the intentionality about our actions are relative to other things, right? And that the where you were saying, from a biodiversity standpoint, just clearing the landscape, and has this massive impact. I mean, not that climate change is insignificant, but this sort of intentionality behind the designs or the way that we build the environment, the way that we build the built environment, is such a driver of the outcomes that we're talking about. That's, I think, a really, really powerful message that I got.
I have this analogy of what I call them Diet Coke landscapes. I mean, I don't think anybody thinks they're getting healthy by drinking Diet Coke per se. They're like doing less damage. But I feel like, in our practices, we think, well, we can design everywhere if we design light enough. And it's really not true. There's a certain point where we have to say, we can't just keep developing land. We have so much land that we've left behind in gray field and brownfield sites that we really need to own it and be a part of that, because we're just subtracting from our wealth of biodiversity in the world.
Yeah. So, I mean, on that point in particular, so where's the cutoff though? In you know, I mean, in Yield the Same Charge, you talked about how, I think for you as a designer, designing a community that was less dense was sort of challenging, right? Because you're used to density, right? But at that point, there's this, there was the respect for local culture and local preferences, was sort of an important driver of what you did. So you had to sacrifice to some extent. There were trade-offs to some extent. I mean, do you have a rule of thumb of where you sort of make those decisions where, local preferences and cultural respect drives, as opposed to sort of more broadly derived environmental principles that you might have?
Yeah, I do think it's a sliding scale, and it's negotiated. Like, I wasn't gonna tell the tribe to go relocate to a condo. I mean, that just would be an absurd thing to do, to put that on them, and to be honest, a lot of people are living. They may be living spread out, but they're living in a very low carbon way in terms of consumption patterns. But I know in the aggregate, I kind of look at it more in the carrot way. I wish there were some growth boundaries that cities and places could commit to. It's kind of an old idea, but the trajectory has to be toward most of the solutions for human beings need to be in, what I call a Philadelphia level of density, which is between 15 and 30 units per acre. And that's a row house community. That's if you're looking at row house blocks, that's what you're looking at in terms of density.
So just sort of going back up to the very beginning, again, some comments on your early presentation slides. There was a question about knowledge and environmental literacy, and whether, the solutions that got us out of the Dust Bowl were sort of incorporated knowledge of the land, knowledge of landscape, knowledge of soil, maybe farming, agricultural lifestyles that are or are not alive today in certain places. As you've sort of scanned the sort of, let's call it broadly, green infrastructure practice, with the way it was 60, 100 years ago compared to today, is there more or less of inspiration derived from sort of land management or cultural practices that are associated with the land?
I mean, I think culturally in the aggregate, we're not getting the education we need about a lot of things, but I definitely feel that our environmental education is low and limited. And even for our practice and profession, I mean, we're told to, focus at certain things. It's like the magic trick is you tell people to look at this thing when something else is happening over there. And it really was striking to me when I realized how much of a footprint just expansionary land development, or an example would be agriculture. The water crisis right now that many places are experiencing at the state level are because there is agricultural water rights reform that's needed. We're growing tons and tons of, in the southwestern states, alfalfa, which is a grass that wants as much water as sugarcane does. and we're using it to feed cows so that we can have a lot of beef to eat. And it's consuming massive amounts of water, way more than an almond would. And actually on that, like for like a dairy cow needs more water than the same scale of like water production that you're getting from like the nut milks and the oat milks, for example. I think that kind of knowledge about where the real draws on resources are, we need a better collective education about that, because and it's not advanced science concepts to understand, but we're not being exposed to them.
And maybe I'll add, like, across the 4 projects, one of the themes today is design, but, we didn't show up, by at least our standard, that much design work, actually, that in the traditional sense, like new projects. A lot of the design work for these projects is in the communication tools and that literacy. So, when you're dealing with all these different topics, bringing all the different stakeholders and community members up to the same bar so that we can have a conversation together across the different topics and understand priorities. So that's another big driver in the work.
Yeah, really interesting to think about that as a design activity, right? There was another question about, again, going back to your example from the 30s, the sort of expectations that people had of government action, or the role of government in either getting us in or getting us out of certain situations. And I mean, in your presentations today, there was very little discussion of government, right? I mean, it seemed like you made it look easy, but hey, regardless of whatever the governmental constraints are, here are these 4 projects, and here's some really interesting ways that we negotiated to get where we needed to get. But I'm, especially today, I mean, in today's day and age, there's a lot of discussion about the impact that government actions or inactions are having on things. So, I mean, just can you speak to your experiences of, maybe experiences where government actually facilitated your ability to get where you needed to get, or hindered it? And what do you say to those of us working today on these types of projects with sort of government action a little bit uncertain?
Yeah, government is always tough, because it's not only politics, it's the infrastructure of policy that is law, and sometimes policy isn't aware enough. Like for example, and Nate was just talking about it's sometimes it's really hard to be a designer. Like if you're working in a community and there's this great park opportunity, a lot of people have some trepidation. If it's in a low income community, you start to feel like you might be the bad guy. If it's a community that has a lot of rental housing and low income, they start to worry that this is going to force the rents up and this is going to cause me to lose my home, when the intention was to make a great place for everyone. And so that led to, we needed more sensitive policy, and Nate presented our gentrification map, where we mapped out for LA County. We said, look, these are all the areas that are highly sensitive to improvements that would drive up land costs. If you do something here, you have to mitigate it, and you have to have that perception. So sometimes we're asking for policy, working with the Ile de Jean Charles community was very, very fraught with government conflicting mandates. It was HUD and FEMA, they didn't have a model of preserve indigenous community land, and in terms of a resettlement and retreat policy. That was new and novel, and trying to figure that out as to what is just and what is equitable. One of the things that was very, very hard. Was this an indigenous communities agency about what they wanted and the terms of which they wanted it? The federal government giving this $50 million award, but the strings to that award had to do with, staying compliant with a resettlement policy where you couldn't continue to live on both sites. But then there's the conflict of this being sovereign community. They were a state recognized tribe, but they weren't a federal recognized tribe. So that led to a lot of conflict on the sovereignty of what they could continue to do with their land, even though they had suffered a lot of flooding impacts directly related to all the issues with industrialization of the Gulf Coast. The hazard mitigation side of government was really scratching their head about how to accommodate that cultural agency of place with the resettlement. And then the Office of Community Development for the state of Louisiana, they thought, well, this is going to be a great example of how a lot of coastal Louisiana communities can adapt. But then they realized this is costing a lot. There's a lot of complications in terms of the agency and rights of an indigenous community, applying that to all citizens of Louisiana. So it was a mess, and the tribe also felt that they had very little agency in this process. They were they thought they were awarded one thing to help determine their future according to their sovereignty. And then they found there's all this policy about what the government feels is fair, equitable, and preserves health, safety, and welfare. So it wasn't easy.
I'll add one more clarifying thing to a couple of the projects I was talking about. And, the LA River Master Plan, it was carried out by the LA County Flood Control District. And, ultimately their mission is flood risk reduction. And that was one of the 9 goals. And they get all the credit, I think, for in that infrastructure focused plan of taking on those additional 8 goals. And I think a lot of that's driven, one, by the fact that the county and the flood control district, they really large territory. I believe the county is one of the, if it was a state, it'd be like the 4th largest economy. It's, so the resources were there, but then also the fact that, again, the county, the river was entirely within the county. And so it was a single government overlooking this really large piece of infrastructure. Whereas in the Climate Resilient Communities Project, we're looking at, a lot of different county and municipal governments here along the Delaware River. And what was really the driver on that project was the realization that they're all in different places, have varying levels of capacity. And it's still, that project's still playing out, but the hope is that in this case, that those varied governments can come together and learn more from each other, collaborate and go after, the resources that are needed at the scale needed to address this problem long term.
But it's interesting because in both of those examples, yes, it's hard, but you seem to have achieved some level of flexibility in, with your clients or with your partners through rational engagement or, rational discussion of what you're trying to accomplish and what it really takes to get there, which is I think of that as a very sort of uplifting experience to relay, as opposed to, no, the regulations are very rigid and leave very little space for negotiation and sort of brokering of outcomes that you might want to achieve. That's good to hear.
Yeah. Most people want to do good things, and I still believe that that's the case. I think the politicized environment that we are, that is being used for, I think the soundbite factors is troubling and disturbing, but the thing that I have the most faith in strategically, and it goes back to something you know I learned from like Eric Kleinenberg, sociologist, work on the heat wave in Chicago that he studied, is like who survived in a heat wave in Chicago, who was vulnerable in a poor community. Why did some communities do well and some did terribly in that great heat wave? And what he found was communities where residents that would check on each other, would see each other, would organize at some level, their resiliency was way higher. And where we've landed with the Clean Air Council work, a lot of the communities haven't been organizing and planning for a while, and their greatest vulnerability is not having an opportunity to come together and see each other and talk about what to do about it and have a common message of what to ask for. So I think going back to Nate talking about the design is sometimes in the communication. Sometimes that's the biggest part of our role is helping communities ask for the things that they need and putting it together and helping to be part of that fabric. But ultimately, I think to get government to be saner, it comes down to these organizational factors of how we come together.
Just because you mentioned the gentrification issues in Los Angeles, and there was a question specifically about that. How did you, in specific terms, right? You came up with a very sort of multi-layered master plan, but what were the features that you incorporated in that master plan to try to protect against gentrification associated with the very improvements that you're making?
Yeah, and I didn't have a slide to it. I think I mentioned it in brief, but it wasn't a particular like design element, but one of the things that came out of the master plan effort and is sort of now separate from it was the beginning of this county land bank. And so this, I'm not as, that's operating independent of us. I'm not, current on its state at the moment, but the idea behind it was that the county being aware of where, these opportunity sites are along the LA River and then how long it takes to achieve these projects, right? That they could get out in front of that and look for vacant land and other low value sites that could be purchased and held for affordable housing. So that was broadly the strategy, and it has to be implemented at scale, right? To be effective.
Yeah, and I think about I'm hoping that maybe a silver lining out of the fires, which are beyond tragic. They're beyond tragic for the human cost. And as Nate pointed out, the wildlands all burned up. I mean, that was, so it's 2 points of devastation. Also, Nate pointed out that the Pineapple Express, rain event that is coming through is also could trigger mudslides, but I hope it catalyzes a lot of focus on housing, because if you do housing right, I mean, it's weird to be a landscape architect, but I'm like housing. Is if we did housing better, we could preserve a lot of environment, we could preserve affordability, we could help communities have options in terms of what I'd call retreating locally versus simply displacement. So I just want to push that as a new policy solution, that we really need a next generation of the big housing move that was, say, done in the post-World War II era.
And I'm assuming based on your previous comments that you would love to see that in existing developed spaces. So it's like rehousing as opposed to new housing type.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was all, looking at infill sites in the community as well. So we're not displacing people to some other part of the county.
And that's what we did in Caño Martin Peña, is was a huge part of it, was could we develop a development choreography that could allow us to build up and more densely. And again, when government was working, the reason why government worked was because it didn't helicopter in and like it was there when an emergency came. And the Enlace Public Corporation has been working with the communities of Caño Martin Peña for 20 years. And so planners aren't some remote, like, oh, there's a community meeting this week, and then happens for a few weeks and then it's over. This was an institutionalized level of ongoing community planning, and it has allowed some profound moves to happen. I don't know any community anywhere else where there's been 600 relocations in modern times and it not be a civil rights disaster. The families feel that they understand why they're moving, they're compensated fairly for moving, and when it happens, the people who facilitate the process have actually had relocations happen to them themselves. So they've kind of made a culture of this kind of adapting through some pretty harrowing circumstances.
So, I mean, building on that, so that in Caño Martin Peña was your effort as the designer was greatly assisted by the pre-existence of Enlace. But in a place like Ile de Jean, though there's a question about just more about how you undertook that planning process, right? So you didn't have an Enlace there. So if you could speak to, how much time it took, what kinds of sort of resistance to your engagement you might have encountered, the capacities that you needed to bring to that effort, could two landscape architects and urban designers come in and do this, or did you need specialized skills for engagement? Anything you can talk about sort of that particular engagement process?
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, I found the process at Ile de Jean, Charles, very, very complex. And while I think the whole team served to the extent that they could, I feel like more could be done. And it may have been a place where the development on how to serve, is still a work in process that really I have a lot of fear about as more and more communities have to confront this. But we had, as part of our team, an indigenous representative who wasn't from the area, but he frequently worked with indigenous communities and was an indigenous person himself. And that was part of building trust. Prior to the design engagement, when this funding had been awarded, which it wasn't awarded directly to the tribe, it was administered through the state of Louisiana. They had engaged and met with the families, for, I believe, over a course of a year. But when we got there, the tribe had already tried to do some planning and had started working out their own plan, but then it had to be through a federal process and the state process, and so that wound up being awarded to our team. I kind of learned some of this, as we were becoming part of the project. So that was very frustrating in terms of like who had the money and who had the control. Those things should have been more clear. I think at the same time that people need enough time for things to happen in a way that they can have agency over it, people also who have been hit with disasters many times are also pretty fed up. There can be a lot of planning fatigue, and so we need to have a process where people get wins along the way. They see daylight along the way. And so in the planning process, I think the things that we did right was being very careful of saying, okay, we're going to try and make things a better version to the extent that we can of what you have, a better house, a house that doesn't flood, property that is at least the size of the property that you have now. Thinking about the context, you're a very private community. How do we keep the development in the context, private to your culture? So those are things that I felt were both the rights and the wrongs of it. And I think there's a lot of lessons for both government and plan administrators and policymakers to have eyes wide open about, as well as designers and engineers. There's this tango of what solutions are possible given these financial funding opportunities that come for relief. So sometimes the system can feel very frustrating.
Yeah. As we sort of wind down, we have some very site-specific questions, but I wonder if I could just, you briefly mentioned, Richard, early on, the circular economy, as sort of a inspirational concept here. But when I think about something like the circular economy, I think of a really sort of comprehensive way of looking at everything, right? All the inputs, all the outputs, all of the interacting dynamics, and really trying to kind of optimize that complexity to get what you want, right? But on the other hand, all of the projects involve a degree of negotiation and trade-offs, and so there are some people asking, does that lead you, Nate, you talked about in Ferraro Fields this sort of multifunctionality, and someone's asking here about combination of measures. So is that sort of where it all goes, is that you look at all of these competing factors and you're not going to come up with a singular solution? I mean, you're not going to come up with a concrete line channel that the previous generation of designers came up with LA. That may solve one problem, but it creates a dozen other problems. And so that means we're going to be less optimal in terms of solving any one problem and more optimal in solving multiple problems, this sort of circular economy idea. Would you agree with that? Or is that always the way it works out? Or is something like the circular economy a useful planning concept going into this, or is it sort of emergent, right? You sit and you talk to people and you find out what 2 or 3 things you can accomplish there, and then that becomes the driver.
Yeah, I think we move on a pendulum of things. We're not going to become like complete island economies unto ourselves. It makes me think of the Animal Vegetable Miracle book that Barbara Kingsolver had. Yeah, there's some things that are going to remain globalized resources, and that's okay. But I do think that we do need to look a lot more closely at what our local resources and options are, and that people and culture and community are an economy. And I think we do have a way of, we do live in a world that's become too discretized, too discrete. And we do need, our best integrative impulses are when we're thinking about, those around us, because that's what the human, capacity has the best level of empathy for. There was something about the LA River channel that I wanted to respond to.
Maybe single versus multiple.
Oh, single versus, yeah. So one of the points that I wanted to make is that it's just a singular to say, I'm going to restore the LA River to its, we're going to rip out the concrete and it's going to be this ecological thing again. And I'm like, Nate had this great diagram like 60,000 people displaced if it's like you know 5 times the width, and that's not to count the hospitals, the police stations, the schools, all that infrastructure. Where does it go? And so yes, we have to live with multiplicity, and that's the conversation that we need to make accessible to people.
Great. You have Linda Rosenwein of Germantown Radio wants to hear the both of your thoughts on Market Street.
What aspect of Market Street?
Landscaping, nature, flooding, the future, you know, are there, you know, how do you take your approach and think about it there? And actually I'll ask you, these are the two local questions.
Sure.
There was another question about whether you're involved in Ann Spern's West Philadelphia project, or, you know, where it seems like a neighborhood scale approach is similar to your own.
Well, on the Market Street question, or you know, thinking about, you know, like its economic development future, one of the things that I think a big economic solution, you know, that you know will land itself in, I think is not the way to. We need something more comprehensive and something that thinks about all the scales there. I think you know, I don't think the Chinatown community is anti-development, but I think they wanted a bigger role in terms of what was happening, and having a voice and agency. I think I think the political will to do something transformative will be at its best when it's engaging everybody, because it's such an important area of our city that we want to be a part of our, you know, social and commercial lives. And I think everybody wants that, but I think it's a case of who's in on the conversation and who's a part of it, and is it really long-term economic thinking, or you know or is it just a big idea? And so that's the pressure that we all feel and that we have to get on top of. So I don't want to put anybody else's ideas down, but I know that's the community conversation that's desired. And then in West Philadelphia, I did engage with Ann Spern and also a dear friend of hers who had lived in the community for a great deal of time as an advisor, Francis. And there's so much reinvestment needed in West Philadelphia's communities, because we're serving as part of the rebuild program, helping to revitalize playgrounds, but a bigger vision is needed in terms of the housing pressures that people face as West Philadelphia continues to develop. That faces a lot of gentrification pressures. We really need to dive into economic development for everyone, housing stability for everyone. You know, Ann Spern, you know, one of the first things that she started talking to me about was the tangled titles issues, that a lot of people don't have secure title to their houses. And that's something that is, you think you're going in to do something in the park, but you realize there's a much bigger thing to address. So we're doing a small thing that we're proud to be part of, but there's a bigger thing that I think Ann is talking about that you know, needs to be more comprehensive.
Great. Well, thanks. This has been this took us right up to the hour. It's been a really exciting set of ideas and projects to talk about. So I just want to thank the both of you for being willing to do this. And there's been a number of questions about whether they can see your slides, and I'm just going to mention, I said it in the beginning, but we're posting, this has all been recorded. It'll be posted on the CC Run website, so folks can engage with the slides that way through the recording. And thanks again to the both of you, and we invite everybody to come back the beginning of March for our next the next in this series. So thanks again. Have a great night, and thanks for sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you all for your questions. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Franco.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.